Beethoven's String Quartet in B-flat major, Opus 130, contains a dynamic range of emotions and characters, a compelling narrative stretching over a 6-movement journey. It's one of his 5 final works, the late string quartets, epic pieces which contrast the timelessness of life with its brevity. Beethoven chooses the string quartet to pour some of his most intimate thoughts and feelings, and we seem to be transported into another world entirely. By 1825, into his mid-50s, Beethoven's health was failing. His deafness had been profound for decades, leading to an acute isolation from the world. He had never married and was estranged from his nephew at this point, and he suffered from a variety of chronic illnesses as well: asthma, GI disorder, and eventually liver disease. Despite these torments, Beethoven never lost his sense of optimism, and that's abundantly clear in this quartet, Opus 130. Throughout the 6 movements, most of the music is congenial and upbeat. Yet underneath the surface, there's a supreme depth at work. Throughout the movements, it's as if we're peeling back Beethoven's subconscious slowly until we come to the core of his vulnerability. In the end, Beethoven launches music deep into the future by revealing life's ultimate joy. Beethoven, the heroic, is a topic that runs throughout his compositional output. Particularly in his middle period from the early 1800s, Beethoven writes works like the Eroica Symphony and the Fifth Symphony, which seem reflective of an individual against a society, maybe with Beethoven himself as the protagonist. Now, jumping forward 20 years, when we get to his late style, what was a bold statement out seems to be turned inner. Beethoven utilizes the string quartet for what it's really good at: intimate conversations between friends as well as dialogue within oneself. For the first time in his life, Beethoven turns away from sketching melodies on just one line and has 4 lines from its conception, reflective of an equal quality between the voices. The slow introduction is particularly inspiring in the way that it sets up all 6 movements of the piece, and with very simple ideas. Now, the most prominent of these ideas is called truncation, in which rhythmic values get faster and faster in anticipation. Nonetheless, when we first hear the truncation, it's in a reaching gesture that's immediately denied by a subito piano. This relates to the other main idea of particularly the first movement, starts and stops. While the main allegro body of the movement seems to relate to Beethoven, the heroic, by the time we reach the middle development section, the character has changed into something else completely. What was a trumpet fanfare in the opening theme has now turned into something much more gentle and loving, a conversation between the first violin and the cello. When you put this together with the inner voices gently sighing, we get a texture that seems to reflect the timelessness of looking up at the stars, the harmonies progressing minimalistically as we look out into nature. Beethoven's late style continues to take over the first movement, as evidenced by the starts and stops idea from the introduction, continuing as the slow introduction itself coming back constantly to interrupt the main body of the movement. This happens at key structural moments, as if the narrative can't quite get off the ground, and continues through the very end of the movement. Even though we end triumphantly, right before the ending, we still schizophrenically go back and forth between the slow music and the main heroic music. Now, what could be more unusual for the serious Beethoven than writing not one, not two, but 3 dance movements in a row? This becomes the next defining piece of Opus 130, an inner skeleton of some of the most charming yet elusive music that Beethoven ever composed. What draws or motivates Beethoven to write a 2-minute movement like the second movement, Presto, after such a huge monument as we had in the first movement? Well, this is evidence of Beethoven's extreme contrast of scale in his late style. Come check it out with me. The miniature scale and condensed energy of this music almost recalls Grimm's fairy tales, contemporary to Beethoven. We can imagine a scene with a toy band playing this music, including a little toy drum. While this music is mostly playful, you could say there's almost an ominous threat lurking in the background. The Presto, notably not marked scherzo or joking, has a rustic character and brings us into the topic of folk dance. The cello plays a very percussive mallet-like part that provides an awkwardly leaping rhythmic backbone to the thing. When we get an almost inevitable explosion. The boiling over of the crucible is not quite the ominous threat that we were expecting. Rather, the surprise is in the overt exultation and even humor of the character. The first violin line is an extremely gnarly and virtuosic bit, reminiscent of a country fiddler sawing away joyously. Underneath this, the rest of the band only plays the offbeats, which creates an incredibly powerful swing under these waves of violin sforzandos. You can say that the stops and starts of the band underneath is reflective of the stops and starts that we had in the first movement. This section lasts somewhat longer than the opening toy band music, but it still can't quite sustain itself. Following a couple chromatic, ghoulish cadenzas in the violin, we get fate knocking at the door with 3 unison hammer strikes. These door knocks use a half step, a reference to the opening introduction of the first movement. This ushers us back into the opening toy band music, and hauntingly so for this da capo section. Our next movement is more substantial in scope, yet marked the lighter character of poco scherzoso. Now, in contrast to the previous movement, this dance is more mannered in its style, indicating more of ballet and a little less of dance hall. Due to the prevalence of bowing and curtsying gestures, as well as the highly conversational nature of the music, we can imagine this as a flashback of an aristocratic dinner party. This could be one of those kind of high society functions where everybody is speaking in platitudes and ornate language. Even if it isn't actually a masked ball, it's a figurative game of masks. Now, Beethoven sets the backbone of this movement in highly expressive physical gesture, all within a clock-like framework. Yet there are still starts and stops, sudden lurches and leaps that highlight Beethoven's obsession with angularity. At times it seems like one of the dinner party guests even goes rogue and has enough with the banality. The last of the three intermezzo movements is the charming Danza alla Tedesca, or German dance. This resembles country landlers that Beethoven would have been familiar with from his childhood, growing up in Bonn near the Rhine River. If each of the dance movements has probed deeper into Beethoven's memory banks, we are now reaching towards the core of his being. Landlers were partner dances featuring hops and skips, even stomping and some yodeling. Beethoven speeds up the tempo significantly from what we would expect in a landler, as well as adding a bunch of markings indicating swells and exaggerated gesture. The haunting middle section in minor mode continues some of the frenetic energy from before in a stream of consciousness. Now, when we are launched back into the main body of the movement, the gestures become even more wildly exaggerated, almost to a seasickness. Perhaps Beethoven is a little uncomfortable channeling such youthful, charming emotions, and that is why the gestures become this way. In a fascinating twist, Beethoven chops up the original theme, playing it in a reverse order. Then, in one last adieu to the movement, we seemingly fly off the stage. And finally, we reach the fifth movement. All masks of human existence have been drawn back to reveal only our deepest emotions and our connection with nature and time itself. As profound as it is concise, this Cavatina, or little song, is what Beethoven considered his most emotionally affecting piece of music. Beethoven was drawn to tears just to think of this movement. Now, its expressivity lies in a certain objectivity, a magical strength of inevitability despite its vulnerability. This movement exists as a kind of cosmic pendulum that, ironically, while keeping time, takes us out of time completely. It's one of those moments akin to in Shakespeare where we realize that life is but a stage and we become irrevocably altered by the realization of our fragility in the face of the universe. While the processional quality of this movement could indicate a funeral scene, perhaps for Beethoven himself. The confluence of emotions and feelings in the music extend to far more than grief. It's more of a living testament to our existence in the vastness of space. We reach the crisis point of the movement, marked beklemmt, or oppressed in German. At the faintest possible dynamic, the lower three voices play triplets in unison, which fan out and descend downward. This is the ultimate emotional low point, the failure to even speak. The first violin can only get off one syllable at a time, gasping, crying out, unable to complete a sentence. This moment, however, is fleeting as we are thrust back into the main body of the Cavatina for one last song. A fun fact, the Cavatina was so profound that Carl Sagan picked it to be on the golden record. This was an archive showcasing the best of human culture for any potential extraterrestrial life on the Voyager spacecrafts in the 1970s. In reaching for the unexplainable in his music, Beethoven really did reach for the stars. In the final moments of the movement, we get one epic reaching gesture towards the heavens and a fading out into timelessness. So how do you proceed from such a great gift of human vulnerability as the Cavatina? The Grosse Fuge, or Great Fugue, begins with more than just a bang, a rocket. What's this? Where are we heading? This movement was so controversial that Beethoven was forced to later replace the whole movement. It's such a behemoth, and at times it sounds cacophonous, but it's actually highly ornate and sophisticated. In spite of an obvious homage to J.S. Bach, the master of the art of fugue, Beethoven is really writing more of an opera in a string quartet, and a piece that will launch music 100 years into the future. We start off with an overture section in which Beethoven is presenting the atmosphere of what is yet to come. This will eventually lead to the first fugue.
What even is a fugue?
A fugue is a musical structure built upon a subject, a theme that's layered on top of itself with increasing complexity and variation. We hear the subject in a hushed call in the first violin. Now, this theme is prescribed with one of the most curious markings in musical history. Every note is 2 eighth notes slurred together, replacing a typical quarter note. This effect is called Bebung. In his 1752 treatise, the flutist Quantz defines Bebung as the reblowing into a note in the middle of a note for emotional affect. Scholars say that this has its origins in a technique for the clavichord, Bach's preferred keyboard instrument to compose with. This effect is similar in a way to a vibrato, a pulsation after the initial stroke of a key. Now, Bebung is a technique that's basically impossible on a modern piano. And it's equally as frustrating to try on a violin with a bow. But it is the intention of this gesture which really counts. In fact, you could say that this pulsation relates to the truncation motive found throughout all of Opus 130. It's an energy cutting the note in half into a silence. The Grosse Fuge, or the Great Fugue, owes its name not only to its trailblazing character, but also the fact that it is constructed on not just one, but two fugue subjects at the same time. A double fugue. Here's the first subject, which we've already heard. And this is paired with the new subject in dotted rhythms. Now these two subjects are perfectly woven together. They're invertible and inseparable throughout this first fugal section. Have a listen. These two subjects are actually incredibly well knit together. The way that there's a rest in the dotted figure right as we get the second Bebung. Yet the music still strikes us as incredibly odd because of the nature of the subjects themselves. The way that the Bebung has all these chromatic notes and is on offbeats, and the way that the dotted figure constantly has a pickup that leaps. But Beethoven doesn't stop there. The music becomes increasingly more complex, with things like the second subject turning into triplets. It's as if we're getting so dizzy from swirling around! We get an angelic menamoso section, combining the slow theme from the introduction in a fugato with the main Grosse Fuge theme. Now, the affect of this section seems linked to the kind of crystalline, looking up at the stars quality of the first movement's development, in which we feel out of time. When we resume motion, it's in a scherzo-like section, a 6/8 lilt, much more jolly and lighthearted than the previous high-voltage material. After being interrupted by a more violent fugue in 6/8, we finally reach the summation of the whole movement, a moment so glorious as to resemble Handel's Messiah, a piece that Beethoven adored. Beethoven channels the adulation of creation itself by texturing the menamoso theme with not just one, but all of the Grosse Fuge themes at the same time, in a convocation of life's joy. The Grosse Fuge is a particularly heightened example of Beethoven anticipating another age in music and in history. He worked tirelessly as a craftsman despite physical and mental torments. This piece demonstrates such a great spirituality and a channeling of a higher power. And Opus 130 as a whole is such a titanic celebration of life and the will to live. Ending Opus 130 with the Grosse Fuge in a way avoids true resolution. The stops and starts never quite cease. But what we do get at the end is a galvanizing race to the finish, heart palpitating and full of joy. And this is why we love Beethoven. In the end, he always triumphs, and his music along with him.